welcome. Let us move on to the 49th lecture. We will discuss here with respect to the pricing, particularly the carbon pricing and carbon market mechanism in continuation to our discussion on the broader framework of climate finance. To discuss about this, we will cover the following points. First one is carbon pricing mechanisms and PPP, polluters pay principle. Friends, many of you might have heard about polluters pay principle. What happens in 1972 in Stockholm conference, when that time we have been bothered about environmental pollution in terms of air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution and all. That time when India was represented by the then Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and this concept has been brought out first. So, she argued that if the countries who because of the content or preservation of or conservation of lot of forest, they are behaving as the sink as far as the polluters are concerned, they are observing. So that means the countries who are polluting, they should pay to these countries who are behaving as a sink because of higher presence of the forest or the green vegetation. So that is how the pricing mechanism first time came in terms of environment and the climate sector. So that means if you are polluting and your pollution is absorbed by the forest what I have, that means I should be paid by you. So that is the concept in terms of polluters pay principle, PPP. So that actually given the idea of a pricing. So taking a clue from this, the carbon pricing mechanisms have also been fixed, and as we have been discussing in Kyoto Protocol 1997, also this way the CDM has been framed first. So the price mechanism, the business in the back of or for the climate or in the domain of climate is very well placed, very well structured now, or is getting well structured. So what I mean to say, since 1972 onwards, when we coined the term PPP, polluter pay principle, since then the pricing or the costing thing have entered into the domain of environment and climate. Next is a kind of comparison of carbon tax versus emission trading system, you call it ETS. So what is the carbon tax? So do we have a tax in terms of carbon? If let us say the coal industries is emitting lot of carbon or greenhouse gases in terms of the coal miners or coal powered industries or coal powered plants. So these coal powered plants, should they be levied some kind of carbon tax, because they are emitting lot of CO2 or CO2 equivalent or greenhouse gases, including high heat temperature. So this has to be thought of. That means if the industry or the plant is at any point of time during or in the course of their activities are emitting the greenhouse gases or CO2 equivalent, then they should pay a tax for that. And also we should have a kind of emission trading system. So there should be a trading mechanism as far as the emission is concerned, emission reduction is concerned, so which is put under ETS. The third point we will be discussing is about the types of emission in terms of the trading systems. Then coming to the compliance versus voluntary carbon markets, definition of functioning carbon credits and carbon offsets, carbon finance mechanisms such as CDM, CER, VRs and RED plus, and towards the end we will talk about some example as far as the Infosys how it has come out with a strategy in terms of realizing carbon neutrality in its own sector. So, coming to the climate change abatement costs. So, this is in terms of climate change abatement, this shows the cost and potential of different options to reduce the greenhouse gases. So, in terms of this we have market based policy, we have research and development policies, we have command and control policies. So, all these things involved in terms of what you say the abatement costs, the carbon tax and carbon permit, where a small nudge could trigger action for low positive abatement costs in terms of market based policies. Look at the left hand side, it talks about a kind of marginal abatement cost curve, and you can see on the y axis it is shown in terms of euros, the money in terms of euros per ton of carbon dioxide emission. So, the market based instruments are cost effective. Mechanisms like emissions trading systems ETS achieve emission reductions at lowest marginal cost. So, command and control policies, market based policies includes carbon tax and carbon permits, and research and development and other deployment policies are also there. So, this is evaluated against some cost, and there is high cost in terms of R&D. There is medium cost in terms of carbon tax and carbon permit, but it is negative when we come to command and control policies, where the abatement costs are negative. As far as the instruments and mechanisms are concerned, the carbon pricing aims at internationalizing external costs of pollution. So, it also puts a price on in terms of some units, you say tons of greenhouse gases or CO2 equivalent emitted. It also follows a kind of PPP, polluters pay principle, and it also have provision for to incentivize operators to reduce their emissions by switching to low carbon technologies and products. Look at the implicit and explicit carbon prices in terms of types of carbon pricing mechanisms. We can see that under explicit we have voluntary market and compliance market. Under implicit carbon pricing we have internal tools. So, as far as the voluntary market is concerned, it functions outside of compliance markets, and as far as the compliance market is concerned, it is created and regulated by mandatory national, regional or international carbon reduction regimes. So, under the voluntary market we have VCM, it is abbreviated, and under compliance we have two. First one is ETS, emission trading system, the one we talk about that gives a kind of what you say permits to pollute and preserve or come back. And then in terms of carbon tax, explicit tax rate on greenhouse gas emission or carbon content of fuel, particularly the fossil fuels. So, moving to internal tools. Internal tools used to entities, particularly the corporates, government and financial institutions to guide decision making. So, internal carbon pricing includes or applied to emissions, particularly internal carbon fee, also theoretical price on carbon to evaluate investment strategies, particularly in terms of a shadowing of prices. So, as far as the carbon policy instrument is concerned, it can also be divided into two components. One is market based, another is regulatory instruments. So, within market based you have carbon tax, carbon finance, emission trade, because these are market based instruments, but regulatory we have BPA and we have RED plus as reduction in emission due to deforestation and reduced degradation, and also we have CDM, these all clean development mechanisms. So, they all fall under the regulatory instruments. Coming to the domestic carbon pricing, particularly the emission trading versus the carbon tax. In terms of emission trading, the emission is certain, whereas in terms of carbon tax it is not that certain. Price for emission trading is uncertain, but for carbon tax it is really certain. For administration point of view, the emission trading is more complex, whereas it is very simple as far as the carbon tax is concerned. So, importantly, we find the difference between the emission trading and the carbon tax. So, carbon tax is more a kind of market based instrument. Emission trading is under the CDM mechanism and mostly fall under the regulatory instrumentation within the carbon policy domain. So, these are the two various different ways in terms of explicit carbon pricing and implicit, and voluntary carbon market, emission trading scheme, carbon tax is concerned. Now, setting a price as far as the carbon tax is concerned, what leads to setting a price? Look at on the left hand side, there are uncertainties in price, particularly provide certainty about the price. Emission certainty cannot set the amount of emission reduction in advance. Consumer impact, tax costs passed on to final consumers. Company obligations, pays taxes on each ton of emissions. Tax rate definitions, directly defined on carbon dioxide equivalent or carbon content. Government role, sets the tax rate for economic activities. So, as far as the carbon tax flow or cap and trade flow is concerned, in terms of this you can see you have the for green investment per ton of carbon emitted, and there is investment by government. In terms of cap and trade flow, you can see you set an emission cap, issue some allowances, and companies they also pay you allowance. There is a buy and sell of advances allowances in terms of the market based mechanism. So, finally, carbon price set by market traders. So, carbon revenue is equivalent to the emission reduction in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent into the market price per tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So, carbon tax in terms of C, or you say abbreviated, is a direct price instrument. It is the carbon tax is a direct price instrument where the government sets a fixed fee on every tons of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent that is emitted from various sources, including fossil fuels or the industrial sources. So, mostly the fossil fuels such as coal and other burning other fossil fuels because of burn. So, the emitter pays the tax. If you are emitting as a industrial source, as a miner, as a individual house means household cooking, so the polluter has to pay, the emitter has to pay. So, the market decides how much to emit. Okay. So, it is different from an ETS in that the emission reduction outcome of a carbon tax is not predefined by the carbon price. So, this is the major thing as far as how to set a price. The market decides in terms of carbon tax how much to emit. In terms of emission trading scheme, that is the emission reduction outcome of a carbon tax is not predefined, but the carbon price is fixed. How much will be emitted or how much emission in reduction, that is not predefined, but the price is predefined, whereas in terms of carbon tax how much you will emit is predefined. So, very tricky and complementary kind of things. You cannot emit beyond this per year, per day, per some time duration. But here in case of carbon tax, in case of ETS, unlike carbon tax, in ETS the price is fixed, but how much you will emit or how much emission reduction you will do, or CERs you want, or ER you will generate, that is not fixed. So higher price leads to farms choosing cheapest abatement route, that will lead to total fall in the emissions. So price certainty will lead to emission volume uncertainty into the regular generation, into the revenue generation. Now with respect to the ETS, emission trading system, market sets the price. So you can see an ETS is a quantity based instrument. Instead of fixing the price, the government fixes the total quantity of emission allowed, that means there is a capping, and then lets the market determine the price of emitting. So per year this much will emitted, then market will decide how much will be the price, whereas in case of CDM or CR it is different. So the core type of ETS is mandatory compliance market, or you say example in terms of EU ETS, European Union ETS, it's the world's largest. China national ETS, UK ETS, RGGI, that means regional greenhouse gas initiatives in northeastern US, California Quebec linked market. So these are all the examples, the units, they are under the mandatory or compliance market, they are performing or functioning under this. Coming to CDM, as we know, it talks about the CER. So in terms of the first one, you have a cap and trade based system. So apply a cap or absolute limit on the emissions within the ETS, and emissions allowances are distributed, usually for free or through auctions or for emission equivalent to the cap. So that's under cap and trade system. Moving on to the next one is the baseline and credit system. So in that, what you do, you define a baseline. The baseline emission level are defined for individual regulated entities, and credits are issued to entities that have reduced their emission below that level. So you set a benchmark, and below that if you have reduced your emission, so it's a ER, then you are eligible for that. So these credits can be sold to other entities exceeding their baseline emission level. So if somebody wants to buy this, okay, you can sell it because you are below the baseline. Somebody if exceeds the baseline level, that unit, person, individual, country, region, or whatever say unit is eligible to buy from you. So you can sell to them or him. So that is how you set a kind of price, you set a quantity. So farm A, look at the diagram. We talk about the farm A, efficient emission below cap, surplus allowances to sell. Farm B at target, that means exactly at allocation, no trade required. Farm C, intensive emission above cap, must buy allowances. So sell and buy first and second, that means farm A and C are connected. You have a carbon market. So that is a calculated either euro or dollar or any other conversion terms, fund conversion terms in terms of tons per carbon dioxide. So higher price, more abatement, lower price, more buying. So abatement decisions and buying decisions are dependent based on price, and so higher means more abatement and vice versa for buying. So this is how the emission in the market sets the price under the ETS or emission trading system. So as far as the European Union emission trading system, EU ETS are concerned, the cornerstone of European Union climate policy, you can see sold this much of deficit, this much of surplus. So you can see the decrease, this is going to in terms of a decrease per year. So steady decline, as you can see on the right hand side. Annual average emission reduction in terms of million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent has been declined. So 122, 134. So 2020 target and 2030 target is showing a declining in terms of average emission. So, there is a reduction in emission. So, the European Union has achieved steady decrease in its emission in terms of net greenhouse gas emission in the European Union were 37% below their 1990 level. Such a good news. This represents a decrease of 8.3% between 2022 and 2023. Within a time span of 1 year, 8.3% decline, really good. So, it started in 2005 as far as you see the cornerstone of EU climate policy. Started in 2005, is the oldest emission trading system in the world and largest in terms of the traded volume. In 2022, the value of the volume exchanged by market participants exceeded to the tune of 1.7 trillion euros. Only China ETS is larger in terms of emission, that is 4,500 million tons of carbon dioxide versus 1,400 million tons of carbon dioxide. The total emissions in terms of emission trading system covered sectors are capped. So, these ETS sectors are capped. So, that means the companies that trade emissions permits and buy more if they emit more. So, a kind of cap and trade mechanism. The cap is reduced every year. Companies are incentivized to reduce the emissions. In terms of compliance and voluntary market, mandatory market and voluntary market, two diagrams on both sides. So, you can see for carbon market, purchase carbon credit, purchase expected carbon reduction. So, mandatory and voluntary, and sell carbon credits, sell expected carbon reduction. So, that is the difference. And you have CO2 emissions, you exceed in terms of CO2 emission, and this side in terms of carbon market in voluntary, CO2 emissions you want to reduce. So, what happens in terms of average price in 2024, compliance market EU ETS was 8200 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, voluntary market was 2 to 12 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So, these all depend on the projects. Mandatory market or compliance market such as EU ETS or GGI are established by the policies mainly governed by the Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. This requires entities to meet emission reduction targets as ER or CERs. Coming to voluntary carbon markets, these are driven by CSR, or you say the corporate social responsibility and the sustainability. They allow companies to purchase credits to offset emissions without regulatory mandates. These markets, which are smaller than mandatory markets, offer flexibility and potential for significant future growth. So, how do we define the carbon credit and offset? You see, first on the right hand side you can see a project that results in the greenhouse gas emissions or their removal from the atmosphere. So, common carbon projects such as renewable energy, forestry, energy efficiency, waste management. So, these projects, through this we generate some kind of offset, carbon or CO2 equivalent offset is created. So, then coming to the next one is the carbon credit, a certified transferable instrument representing 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions that were avoided or reduced or removed from an offset project. So, this amount is now used for offsetting the price of retiring carbon dioxide credit or carbon credits to offset the equivalent volume of emission by the holder or by the unit or the country, whatever is responsible for that. So, look at this, how do carbon markets work? You have site A, you have site B. So, with respect to site A, in terms of compliance market, with respect to site A, You see, with CO2 emissions less than the threshold, so you have a regulated carbon market, so that sells the excess emission quota, and then at site B you have a emission quota purchased by site B. So that means it is aimed at or aimed for the most energy intensive emitters that is there within the climate compliance market. Coming to the voluntary market, on one side you have the organizations, and on the other side you have the carbon credit. So you see, you invest in terms of the organizers, they invest in. So in where? In offset projects to such as eco projects or carbon dioxide avoidance projects. So then these organizers with high CO2 emitters will offset, and through this offset project investment, what will happen? A transferable instrument representing 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions that were avoided or removed. This is now available in voluntary carbon market. So carbon credit is it is a kind of certified and transferable instrument representing 1 ton of CO2 equivalent in terms of greenhouse gases that are either avoided, removed or reduced. So the term avoided here means the gases that didn't enter the atmosphere, while removed means the gas were removed from the atmosphere and safely stored back. That is a tricky difference. It was avoided, otherwise it could have gone. So it was avoided. Removed means it has gone, but we again brought it back and stored in other safe havens or safe residences, as we have discussed already in terms of the oceanic storage or in terms of the geological storage. Credits are created by offset projects and can be retired to offset the equivalent volume of residual emissions by the holder of the credit. So as far as the offset and carbon finance is concerned, the CERs, VERs, CDMs and VCMs of carbon offset represent a project based instruments rather than directly capping or taxing emissions. They fund activities elsewhere that avoid or remove carbon dioxide and translate these reductions into tradable credits. So two markets, compliance regulated offset market and voluntary carbon market. In terms of first one, let us see these exist within the legally mandated framework, that is CDM, all of us know, and the red plus, all of us know. Coming to the next one is the voluntary carbon market, VCM. Companies and individuals buy offsets voluntarily, particularly to reach the net zero pledge outside any legal obligation. So verified emission reductions are the credits that are verified by private standard bodies like Behera or UCS and Gold Standard or American Carbon Registry. So these are the bodies mostly in private domain. They actually verify, okay, through standard methodologies, through standard protocols. They verify that whether whatever you are claiming in terms of CER or in terms of the marketing carbon credits, so that is actually true. So it is verified by this. So verified emission reduction. So type of projects fall under this are reforestation, blue carbon, renewable energy, industrial methane capture and all others. So clean development mechanism, we all know. The verified carbon standards, we all know, Behera is one of the things, and also we have other standards in terms of gold standard, GS for global goals. So these certified projects for sustainability, you can see the sustainable development goal symbol is also there. They focus emission reduction with measurable impacts. So these are the in terms of CDM, the verified carbon standards and the gold standards. Moving on to an example, just to mention Infosys strategic framework for attaining carbon neutrality. So what Infosys is mainly a kind of computation based company. So this company has a three-pronged approach to reduce the greenhouse gas emission and achieve the carbon neutrality, because we all as a in terms of the India's commitment, we are going to achieve net zero by 2070. So, first in terms of this, the first point as far as the Infosys is concerned, it aims to reduce its overall electricity requirement by 50% on a per capita basis. Second, so first it is reducing 50%. Second is it intends in phase 2, it intends to switch the green power for the remaining electricity demand. So, moving on to renewable energy sector. Third, it intends to invest in offset projects for the remaining greenhouse gas footprint. So, whatever other projects are there it will invest. So, that means in this way this particular company is going to achieve the carbon neutrality, or we say net zero. And we have taken help of these references for preparing the slides. And moving on to conclusion, we discussed about carbon pricing, but we understand that it is a key policy tool that internalizes the environmental cost of greenhouse gases emissions or CO2 equivalent emissions through mechanisms such as carbon taxes. We also have discussed the difference between the emission trading and the carbon tax. Carbon tax is a price certainty, emission uncertainty. So, in terms of emission trading system, the emission is certain but price is uncertain. So, these are just opposite kind of things. Both compliance markets and voluntary carbon markets play complementary roles in achieving the global climate mitigation goals. Now, coming to the policy implications, there is a need for integration of global carbon markets as far as Article 6 of Paris Agreement is concerned. Scaling of the climate finance and carbon investments, standardization of carbon credit verification system or the CVS system. We understood Behera and gold standard. There are various private players who verify that whatever you claim in terms of reduction in emission in terms of ETS or carbon tax mechanism are true or scientifically valid. So, what we conclude is carbon credits and offset projects encourage investments in sustainable activities such as renewable energy, afforestation and other things, other fossil fuel things. So, what we understand that carbon pricing is a key policy tool, and there is a difference in terms of taxation as far as the certainty and uncertainty of emission and price is concerned for carbon tax and ETS. We need to comply the market and voluntary carbon markets. With this, we can realize the benefit of this carbon pricing. Thank you very much for attending this lecture.